Brian Robertson had never been the kind of man to cause trouble. He was the type of neighbor who waved at everyone while watering his lawn, offered to help carry in groceries, and never missed a trash pickup day. For 5 years, he had built a quiet, comfortable life in Maplewood Estates, a suburban neighborhood filled with neatly trimmed hedges, well-kept sidewalks, and friendly, mostly, residents. But not everyone had welcomed him. From the moment he moved in, Karen Byork had made it clear that she didn't approve of his presence. She had lived in the neighborhood for over a decade and believed it was meant for people like her. And in her eyes, Brian did not fit that mold. At first, her hostility was subtle, pointed stares, a forced smile that never reached her eyes, crossing the street when he was outside. But over time, her resentment grew bolder. If Brian mowed his lawn, Karen would accuse him of blowing grass clippings onto her driveway. If his trash cans were a few inches over the property line, she'd leave nasty notes taped to them. Once, when Brian had guests over, Karen stood on her porch the entire time, glaring at his friends like they were criminals casing the neighborhood. Still, Brian had ignored it. He had worked too hard to let one bitter woman ruin his peace. But Karen's hatred didn't fade, it festered. She watched Brian's every move, waiting for a moment to strike. And on one particular Friday evening, she decided it was time to get rid of him, for good. The sun had just begun to dip below the horizon as Brian drove home from work, his body aching from a long day at the office. He had been looking forward to this moment all week, Friday night, the start of a quiet, relaxing weekend. Maybe he'd order takeout, watch a movie, and finally get around to fixing that loose cabinet handle in the kitchen. As he turned onto his street, he sighed in relief. Home. He slowed his car, signaling as he prepared to pull into his driveway. The air was still, the neighborhood peaceful. But what Brian didn't see, what he couldn't have known, was that Karen was waiting for him. She had been sitting in her car, gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity. Her heart pounded, her breath came in short bursts. She had convinced herself that Brian was the problem, that he didn't belong here. And tonight, she was going to do something about it. As Brian eased into his driveway, she made her move. She floored the gas pedal. The engine roared as her car lunged forward, tires screeching against the pavement. In an instant, Brian's world exploded into chaos. The impact was violent. Metal crunched. Glass shattered. His car was flung sideways, slamming against the curb with a sickening jolt. The force of the collision sent his head whipping back, his seatbelt digging painfully into his chest. For a moment, he could only sit there, stunned, ears ringing from the sheer force of the crash. Then, through the swirling haze of shock, he saw her. Karen was already out of her car, a dramatic hand clutching her shoulder as she fumbled for her phone. Her expression twisted into something between fear and outrage, but Brian knew better. He knew that this was no accident. It was a setup. Through the cracked windshield, he could see her pointing at him, already yelling into her phone. Hello? 911. Yes. I was just hit by a reckless driver. He was speeding down the street and crashed into me, he could have killed me. Brian's jaw tightened. He had seen Karen pull out of her driveway before, seen the cautious, slow way she backed out, as if she was afraid of hitting a stray leaf. But this? She had aimed for him. He forced his car door open, stumbling slightly as he stepped onto the pavement. His head throbbed, and his hands shook from the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. Karen, what the hell is wrong with you? He demanded. She spun toward him, her face the picture of outrage. Me? You were speeding. You nearly ran me over. Brian's stomach dropped. He wasn't sure what made him angrier, the fact that she had done this or the fact that she was already twisting the truth. In the distance, the faint sound of sirens grew louder. Karen's expression flickered for the briefest moment, was that a smirk, before she straightened up, putting on her best performance. You're in so much trouble, she sneered. Brian exhaled sharply, his mind racing. She had planned this. And unless someone could prove otherwise, she was going to get away with it. As Brian sat in his car, his hands gripping the wheel, the weight of the crash settled in. His ears rang from the impact, and the scent of burnt rubber and motor oil filled the air. His chest tightened as he took stock of the situation, his driver's side was crushed, his airbag had deployed, and his heart pounded in his ears. But before he could even unbuckle his seatbelt, he saw Karen, his neighbor, his longtime tormentor, already out of her car, her phone pressed dramatically to her ear. "Oh my God! He hit me. He was speeding and ran right into me." Karen's voice was frantic, loud enough to ensure that anyone within earshot heard her cries. Her performance was flawless, a well-rehearsed act of false victimhood. She clutched her shoulder, wincing in exaggerated pain as she stumbled away from the wreckage. Brian's blood boiled. He had seen this type of manipulation before, and now he was the target. He pushed his door open, the metal groaning in protest, and stepped out. "Are you serious right now?" he asked, his voice laced with disbelief. Karen whipped around, her eyes wild. "You! How dare you drive like that in our neighborhood? You could have killed me." Brian clenched his jaw, his hands curling into fists at his sides, but he forced himself to stay calm. "You ran into me, Karen. You were parked, and then you just... Don't you dare try to twist this around," she shrieked, taking a shaky step back as if he had lunged at her. "Stay back. Stay away from me." At that moment, the distant wail of sirens pierced the air. Red and blue lights painted the street, flashing against the houses as two police cars pulled up. Officers spilled out, scanning the chaotic scene. One of them, a tall man with a badge reading Officer Reynolds, approached Karen first. "Ma'am, are you hurt?" he asked, glancing at her clutching her arm. "Yes. This man drove into me, recklessly, like a maniac. He must have been drunk or something," she said, pointing at Brian with shaking fingers. Brian scoffed. "That's not what happened, and you know it." Another officer, shorter with a stern expression, turned to Brian. "Sir, do you have anything to drink tonight?" Brian's stomach twisted. He could see where this was going. "No, I haven't been drinking. I was just getting home from work when she..." "We'll conduct a sobriety test to confirm that," the officer interrupted. Brian exhaled sharply. He had done nothing wrong, yet he was the one under suspicion. He glanced at the neighbors gathering at their doorsteps, whispering, some recording with their phones. He had lived here for years, paid his taxes, helped shovel snow from driveways, and yet, at this moment, none of that mattered. Officer Reynolds turned to Karen. "And you said he hit you while speeding?" "Yes. I was just pulling into my driveway when he came flying down the street. I barely had time to react," she lied with tears in her eyes. Brian couldn't take it anymore. "That's a complete lie." The officers exchanged glances. The second one reached for his handcuffs. "Sir, we need you to stay calm and step to the side while we investigate." Brian's heart pounded. He could feel the situation slipping out of his control. He raised his hands slightly. "You're seriously arresting me?" "Without even checking the facts." "We're detaining you for now," the officer corrected. Brian swallowed hard as he felt the cold metal of the handcuffs snap around his wrists. The weight of the moment settled in, he was being treated like a criminal while the real culprit played the victim. Karen's smirk, barely concealed behind her fake tears, made his blood boil. But then... "Wait!" A firm voice cut through the tension. Everyone turned to see an elderly man hurrying across the street, holding up his phone. His silver hair was slightly disheveled, and his breathing was labored from rushing. It was Mr. Fayo, the neighbor who always sat on his porch watching the world go by. "I saw everything," he declared. "And I got it all on video." Silence hung in the air like an axe about to drop. Karen's face paled, her eyes darting toward Mr. Fayo's phone. She took a hesitant step backward, her lips pressing together as if trying to swallow the panic rising in her throat. Officer Reynolds turned to him. "Sir, you said you recorded the incident?" "Yes, and it's clear as day," Mr. Fayo confirmed, tapping his phone screen. He held it up, and the officers gathered around. Brian, still in handcuffs, could only watch as his fate was decided in real time. The video played, Karen, sitting in her car, waiting. Brian's headlights appearing as he turned onto the street. And then, the undeniable truth, Karen gunning her car forward, smashing into Brian's vehicle with full intent. Her frantic performance afterward was captured too, a stark contrast to the calculated aggression from moments before. Officer Reynolds' jaw tightened as he processed the footage. He turned to his partner, who gave a small nod. Without hesitation, the officer stepped toward Brian, unlocking his cuffs. "You're free to go, sir," he said, his tone shifting to something almost apologetic. Karen's expression contorted with rage. "That video, it's fake." "He edited it," she shrieked, her voice rising in desperation. Mr. Fayo chuckled dryly. "I may be old, but I don't know the first thing about editing videos, Karen." The second officer stepped toward Karen. "Ma'am, you're under arrest for reckless endangerment, destruction of property, and filing a false police report." "No. No, this isn't happening," she wailed as her hands were pulled behind her back. The very cuffs that had been on Brian moments ago now locked around her own wrists. As the officers led Karen toward their patrol car, Brian let out a slow breath, the tension finally releasing from his body. He turned to Mr. Fayo, gratitude shining in his eyes. "You just saved me." Mr. Fayo waved a hand. "No, son. The truth saved you. I just made sure it was seen." Brian glanced around at the neighbors watching, some shamefaced, others whispering about Karen's downfall. Maybe, just maybe, things would start to change. And for the first time that night, Brian allowed himself to smile. Brian had barely absorbed the shock of the crash when the first police car arrived, its siren cutting through the evening stillness. Two officers quickly stepped out and assessed the scene, their eyes darting between Brian and Karen. Karen, still playing the role of the injured party, quickly began her rehearsed tale, her voice trembling with feigned distress. "Officer, this man, this maniac, came barreling down the street. He didn't even slow down as he pulled into his own driveway. He hit me. I don't know if he was drunk or on something, but I was barely able to get out of the way." Brian stood there, his blood boiling as she spun the story. He opened his mouth to respond, but the officer held up a hand. "Sir, we'll need you to stay quiet for now." "Ma'am, please tell us exactly what happened." The officer's words barely reached Brian's ears as his heart raced. He was being treated like the criminal, while the woman who had crashed into him with clear intent played the part of the innocent victim. Another officer moved toward Brian, his eyes scanning his body language. "Sir, have you been drinking?" Brian's frustration boiled over. "No. I was just coming home from work. I'm not the one who's been drinking or doing anything wrong. She hit me on purpose." The officers seemed unmoved. They weren't rushing to hear his side of the story, they were only paying attention to Karen, who was still spinning her web of lies. The situation spiraled. The officers moved to put Brian in handcuffs, and his stomach dropped as they clicked shut around his wrists. "What? You're arresting me?" "Sir, we're just detaining you while we investigate," the officer explained, his voice matter-of-fact. Brian's head buzzed as they escorted him away from the wreckage, but before they could take him to the patrol car, an unexpected voice rang out. "Wait!" Brian's eyes snapped to the source of the voice. It was Mr. Fayo, the elderly man who lived across the street. He was hurrying toward the scene, a serious look on his face. "I saw everything," Mr. Fayo said, out of breath from the sprint. And I've got it all on video. The officers exchanged looks, clearly surprised. One of them gestured for Mr. Fayo to approach, and the elderly man pulled out his phone. I always record my yard, you know, just in case. It's my habit. He tapped a few buttons and held the screen up. The video footage played. It clearly showed Karen sitting in her car, waiting for Brian to pull into his driveway. And then, with deliberate intent, Karen slammed her foot down on the accelerator, plowing straight into Brian's car. Her car hit his with such force that Brian's vehicle spun out of control. The footage cut to Karen immediately after the crash, pretending to be in pain as she frantically called the police. The entire situation was there, documented and undeniable. Is that enough evidence for you? Mr. Fayo asked, his voice calm but firm. The officers turned back to Karen, their faces hardening. The once sympathetic stance they had taken now shifted to one of accusation. Karen's eyes widened with panic as she began to stammer. That's not what happened. The video's fake, it's edited. I didn't do anything wrong. The officer who had been questioning her shook his head. Ma'am, you're under arrest for reckless endangerment and filing a false police report. Karen's face twisted with fury. No. You can't do this. I'm the victim here. But the officers were unyielding. They cuffed her and led her to the patrol car, ignoring her protests. Brian, still in shock, was released from his handcuffs. His legs felt like jelly as he stood up straight, the adrenaline beginning to ebb. You're free to go, sir, one of the officers said, offering a half-hearted apology. Brian nodded, his chest heavy but relieved. He looked over at Mr. Fayo, who gave him a small, understanding smile. Thank you, Brian said, his voice thick with gratitude. Mr. Fayo simply waved it off. Don't thank me. Thank the truth. It took weeks for the full weight of what had happened to settle in. Brian had been shaken by the experience, but he was slowly starting to pick up the pieces of his life. The neighborhood that had once felt like home now seemed slightly different, the lines between ally and enemy much clearer. After Karen's arrest, things quickly changed in Maplewood Estates. Her house went up for sale almost immediately, though her departure was met with mixed feelings. Some neighbors were relieved to see her go, while others were still hesitant to speak out. But one thing was clear, Karen's presence had disrupted the peace, and now, with her gone, the neighborhood felt just a little bit lighter. Brian found comfort in knowing that justice had been served. But it wasn't just the legal outcome that mattered, it was the support he received from people like Mr. Fayo. The old man had become a regular visitor to Brian's house, stopping by for morning coffee or to chat about whatever was happening in the neighborhood. In a way, it was their own quiet form of resistance, a testament to the strength of truth and friendship in the face of hate. Brian's reputation was restored, and the scars of that day began to fade. No amount of hatred from someone like Karen could change the man he was, or the life he had built. Things slowly returned to normal in Maplewood Estates, but for Brian, the lesson had been learned. It wasn't just about the battle you fought in public, it was about the support you built in private. And no matter how ugly the world became, Brian was ready to stand tall, no matter what came next. As he sat on his porch one evening, sipping his coffee, he saw Mr. Fayo walking across the street with a grin on his face. The two shared a wave. Brian's smile, though small, was sincere. It had been a long road, but the future was finally looking brighter.